G'day legends and welcome back to the Fanatics Clubhouse. This is Chin Music and my name is Tom Gallop. Cometh the moment, cometh the man. The Toyota Camry of world cricket, VIRAT Kohli, has done it again. His run chase has ended Australia's Champions Trophy campaign. And the other big man, Kane Williamson, has backboned New Zealand's record total overnight as New Zealand have comfortably accounted for South Africa in the other semi-final. Speaking of big men coming to the moment, Moises Henriques is not in Sydney but has been kind enough to wake up at the crack of dawn in Perth and join us as always, my courageous co-host Moe. How is it over there in the Wild West?
Tom, the sun's just risen over here, mate. I'm glad you guys are working comfortable hours over there in the east, mate.
What time did you suggest that we record this podcast, just for all our fans out there? I just want it on the record.
6:30 p.m. tonight, Perth time, so 9:30 Sydney time. That was my suggestion.
I will be at the Roosters Brisbane game at 9:30 p.m. tonight, but if it had been required, Hugo, I want it on the record again that I would have been in Artarmon recording this podcast because it is what I love to do the most. Moe, the big news, I guess, in the last 24 hours before we talk about the games that have happened is the retirement of your great mate Steve Smith. I saw you put an Instagram tribute post out to him. Probably not unexpected, given that he's got a lot on his plate and there's not really a big one-day tournament for a while. But talk to us about your initial reaction about Smudge retiring from ODI cricket.
Yeah, look, it was a bit of a shock to me. I wasn't really expecting it, but yeah, I think it's a good move for him in the sense that I was only thinking a week ago, I guess, how many of the Australian players at the moment rarely play, I guess all the tours to all the formats throughout a year. And obviously with Steve and, maybe Davey before him being batters, physically their loads are a bit lighter than, say, the bowlers are. So their expectation of playing on, a lot more of those tours are probably higher as well. So, he's probably, at a little bit older than the rest, he's probably a little bit worn out, just in terms of the travel and demands of international cricket in all three formats. And has probably decided he wants to focus on, maybe just two of those three, given, his recent success in Test cricket as well as his recent success in domestic T20 cricket. So he obviously still sees himself playing for Australia in international T20 cricket in the future, which I still think he should be playing as well. So if anything, I think that retirement will extend his career in the other two formats, and we'll see Steve Smith playing Test cricket, hopefully for a year longer than maybe we would have otherwise.
You made a point there about talk. You mentioned that Steve could still play T20 cricket for Australia. I noticed that he was very specific about the fact that he was retiring from one-day international cricket. Do you think he still harbours hope to play for Australia in T20 cricket? And the other thing I'm interested in is in 2025, it seems to me that, if we suspected it, we now know it. The kind of ranking of the formats in the minds of the players is kind of Test cricket, probably still number one. For some players who are white ball specialists, probably the Mitch Owens of the future, maybe T20 is the number one. But when once upon a time players might have retired from T20 cricket, then ODI cricket, and played a year or two more of Test cricket, it seems now that the order is slightly changing. Is that the way you see it?
It's definitely the way I see it. I think the order, whilst there's some nuances to the one-day game and some skill that we won't be able to see in T20 cricket or Test cricket, it is definitely the order of if there is one format of the game that needs to be sacrificed, I would say one-day cricket would be the one you'd probably choose to sacrifice. Obviously if you're still performing at a very high level in all three formats, then I would say one-day cricket would be the one. In terms of a physical load and a I guess mental and emotional load as well, that would be the one that I would say and assume that most international and domestic cricketers as well would definitely compromise on.
Hugo just held up a sign saying, "Don't forget, you'll be on camera a lot more this episode." I think my shirt looks 10 out of 10. This is probably my best shirt for this show. My hair is a rabble, which is a shame. Despite it being early in the morning over there, Mo, your hair is not a hair out of place, not a skerrick out of place. You're looking sharp as always from your hotel room in Perth.
Thanks, Tom. And I think we need to start getting someone else to rate the way that you look rather than you rating how you look. Hugo, so if you don't mind holding up an A4 piece of paper for our viewers next time, next to Tom, maybe show your rating rather than Tom just rating himself all the time. I'd love to hear Tom's opinions on some cricket rather than his own looks.
There's some things I know about and there's some things that I don't, but I'm very confident in the way that I look in this shirt, jeans combo. Thank you, Hugo. There's the rating for today. If you disagree, please get in the YouTube comments. Moe, let's get into the game itself. King Kohli, the record is phenomenal. I saw that 4,500 people, roughly, have been fortunate enough to play one-day cricket for their country. 33 of those players have made 8,000 one-day international runs. Virat Kohli has made 8,000 one-day international runs batting second. His record chasing, he averages a smidgen under 65. And given that we will celebrate Steve Smith as a hero of one-day international cricket, certainly in Australia anyway, at 2015 and 2023 World Cup winner, Virat Kohli's record in run chases absolutely dwarfs Steve Smith's one-day record overall. So where do we even start with this bloke? And I'm sure you weren't surprised to see him get India home the other night.
No, I think that innings the other night against Australia, again, just displayed his skill level, his ability to rotate the strike, score runs off, like balls that he faces, score a high percentage of runs off, balls that he faces. So, his skill level in the one-day game, I think, is his peak. It's definitely his best format out of the three, and he's very good at all three. But his ability and his temperament in one-day cricket, his hunger shines through there. And I was actually surprised he didn't get them home the whole way the other night. That's as soon as he got to sort of 40 not out, and I was like, oh, well, he's going to get 105 not out here. Australia aren't going to get him out. And thankfully for Australia, they did get him out. Obviously the damage had already been done, but yeah, and it was another super innings, but it wasn't enough for Australia to get over the line. But yeah, again, it was another display of similar sort of skill to what we saw him do in that 100 against Pakistan. And, I guess what got you to rate him as the world's favorite car, the Toyota Camry, because he is so reliable. Again, I saw at one point he'd faced 85 balls and he was, I think he'd scored 49 singles or 50 singles again, and a handful of twos. So again, scoring, and without boundaries, again, scoring sort of 56 or 57 of the 85 balls that he'd faced, which is, again, just a huge score shot percentage off the balls faced. That's without even including the boundaries, which I think at that point he only had 5 or 6. But again, it just shows you how much he can, or how easily you can chase down a score of 260 without having to always hit boundaries and sixes.
I love this stat because you have been talking about this a bit the last couple of weeks as we focus on the Champions Trophy. But India faced only 124 dots to Australia's 153, and they ran 158 of their runs compared to Australia running only 129 of their runs. So certainly not just power hitting that can get you over the line in these games.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, you look at the game and the scorecard, and India won with 11 balls to spare. And I felt like for about 15 overs there, Virat Kohli, Iyer, and KL Rahul barely took a risk. And it got to until maybe KL was sort of 18 not out or 20 not out, where he finally hit a ball in the air. But before that, it just felt like those three batters had the game in sort of third gear, chasing down exactly what Australia did, or Australia scored, with, taking, I guess, much smaller risks than what maybe other teams have to take to keep the rate up because of their levels of skill and their ability to score off good bowling. And mind you, I watched that game, and Australia didn't bowl poorly. Australia, for those 10 or 15 overs, Australia didn't bowl one boundary ball that I remember watching. And India just were able to sort of score 45, 50, 55 runs off those, off 10 overs without Australia bowling, a half tracker, a half volley, a full toss, or a wide ball. It was actually very good bowling by Australia in that sort of middle to late over period. But India just kept scoring off such a high percentage of balls. It was very hard for Australia to build any pressure.
Before we move on to the other performances, while we're still kind of semi-focusing on Kohli at least, I'd love you to tell the story about when you first saw Virat Kohli at the Cricket Academy some 20 years ago, I think it was. It's an absolute cracker.
Yeah, it was. I think I'd been told we had 4 young Indian players coming over to join the Australian Academy, and I'd been told that a couple of them had just finished in the World Under-19 World Cup, and one of them was the Under-19 captain, and they'd just got off a flight, and instead of going home, they got off the plane and come straight to training. And I remember I was feeding the ball machine to one of them. I was only 20 or 21 myself, and this young Indian batter was batting, and I was pretty excited to see who the captain of the Indian Under-19 team was. And here I was feeding these balls away, and I was like, "Oh, this guy's definitely not him. He can't bat." And then I was like, "Oh, I wonder, this guy must be a sort of spinner or bowls fast or something like that." And then watched him bowl about 2 hours later, and he came in bowling slow medium pace off the wrong foot at training, like shocking. And I was like, "What the hell is this guy doing over here?" And it was only about 6 to 8 weeks later that we played. The Australian Academy team played against an India A team, and that same guy scored 120 against us. And then about 6 months later, he scored 100 for India, very early on in his career in ODI cricket. So it shows how much I know about talent when I first watched them bat. But to my defense, he was just fresh off a flight, and probably didn't have his best ever net session. But yeah, my opinion of his batting after watching it once in a net wasn't the highest. But I will say, after training with him again for the next 4 weeks, you could tell that there was something very, very, very special about Virat Kohli. And I knew that, I didn't know he was going to go on and play and do what he's done in international cricket. No, I don't think anyone could have predicted that, given how successful his career has been. But I knew he was going to go on and play and score some runs for India in the future after that sort of 4-week period of training with him at the Australian Academy.
We have waxed lyrical about Virat Kohli the last couple of weeks, and hopefully he continues to do these things, and we can continue to do so for years to come, because it is, even as an Australian fan, pretty awesome to watch the likes of Virat Kohli go about their work. And of course, we're going to be talking a bit about Kane Williamson, the second of the big four, a little bit later. Having also touched on Steve Smith, we kind of mentioned in an earlier episode that these 4 guys were likely to play a big part in this tournament, and I think Joe Root ended up being the 3rd highest run scorer despite England having such a poor tournament. So pretty amazing to see these guys who've been around for the better part of 2 decades still dominating at this level in an ICC tournament. Speaking of young talent, Cooper Connolly was, I guess, selected out of nowhere. I personally was a fan of the fact that he got picked in November in that one-day tournament against Pakistan. I guess every international game is a big game, but that one was less important than some of the games that have followed this summer. When he was called in to open the batting in this game, sure, the Champions Trophy may not be what it once was. It's not the World Cup, but nevertheless, it's a big tournament, and Australia would have really wanted to beat India. particularly given that India were favourites and Australia were underdogs. They've brought Connolly in to open the batting, and all the cricket players in Australia that I've spoken to think that Cooper Connolly is an absolute star for the future. But to me, as a fan, it looked like he really wasn't ready to perform at that level on such a big stage. Were you surprised to see him come in, Moe?
Well, I mean, disappointingly, Matt Short got injured, so you can't really do too much about that. But yeah, I guess it was out of Cooper Connolly and McGurk for that spot in the end, unless they were going to pick Aaron Hardie to open the batting, who, again, probably given his last few months, he's, not in his highest vein of form either. But, I don't think... I think out of those three guys, they probably picked someone with the most amount of runs behind them in the last 3 months. He obviously had a very good Big Bash. But again, it probably lends to, the whole decision, the selection decisions around the Champions Trophy, and I guess picking exciting talent rather than, a bulk of runs for this tournament. Someone like I guess... I look around and see Daniel Hughes, who's opened the batting for New South Wales for, 10, 15 years, averages almost 60 in one-day domestic cricket, scored, I think, 8, 9, 10 one-day hundreds in, 55 or 60 one-day domestic innings. His record is ridiculous, and has never got the opportunity to play one-day cricket for Australia. And I guess if I was Daniel Hughes and I'm looking around and seeing, these guys that are getting the opportunity to open the batting for Australia on the back of such a small amount of runs in domestic cricket, I would probably be a little bit bitter if I was him. But
you've semi-touched on it there, Moe, but Cooper Connolly's record in List A cricket is 117 runs at 14.62 with a high score of 42. Not the numbers you would expect of the guy walking out in a semi-final against the likes of India in a massive tournament.
No, there's definitely not. You're not picking Cooper because of his, experience and runs in these formats. You're picking him because at the next Champions Trophy or the next World Cup, you're expecting him to be a star in that team. And he's shown some glimpses of some really good batting in T20 cricket and first-class cricket, but we still don't have that bulk of runs yet that, I guess we've seen from, a Daniel Hughes or the others, some of the others in that team like Travis and Steve and Marnus, but or even Matt Short. He's a good example of a young batter who has scored a bulk of runs over the last 2 or 3 years in all three formats domestically. So, I don't think we can be too disappointed when these guys are still learning their trade at the highest level. There's no doubt Cooper's going to be playing more cricket for Australia, but I think as fans and as viewers, we just need to adjust our expectations because he's learning on the go here. He's still just trying to learn about how to play one-day cricket, and unfortunately, he's learning at the highest level on the biggest stage.
I just can't help but feel like it's a little bit of a stuff up because we knew that the day when David Warner was no longer in the team was coming. And you and I have spoken about the fact that players like Nathan Ellis, Josh Inglis were blooded at appropriate times so that when it got to this tournament, these guys were ready for the big tournament atmosphere, environment. I just can't help but be confused by the fact that someone like Cooper Connolly, who is going to be a star of the future and deserves the chance to be nurtured and to get to the point where he's ready for this, is the guy who's thrown in that moment, because it's certainly, in my opinion, not the best thing and not giving Australia the best chance to win, but it's probably not the best thing for him as well. We don't have to continue to litigate it, but in my mind, that was a questionable selection at best. Travis Head on this occasion was not India's daddy. He was probably India's stepdaddy. He threatened to get going, but then played a pretty loose shot, I thought, to the first ball that he faced from that. I think it was the left arm ortho. I don't have the name in front of me. I can't remember who got the wicket, but
mystery spinner.
Mystery spinner. he threatened to get going. It's been pretty funny. Hugo and I were chatting just then about the fact that Indian cricket fans have absolutely towered Travis Scott, the rapper, on Instagram instead of Travis Head. A little bit of a confusion there. If you are looking for some light entertainment, listeners, do get on Travis Head's Instagram and read some of the passionate comments that get left by fans of other nations, but particularly on things like his wedding, which is quite confusing. But Heady didn't get going. It looked like Steve Smith and Alex Carey were going to get Australia to the point where they would get a big total. On Kez first, Moe, he has really found his feet over the last 3 months. You'd think that potentially the introduction of Josh Inglis into the Test team and then the fact they're both playing in ODI cricket might have threatened his confidence, but it's actually brought out the best in his game. I think that shot that he played over cover in particular was the shot of a man who is in complete control of his game.
Yeah, you're right, Tom. And I'm not sure if it's, whether it's, I guess, aligned with Josh being introduced to international cricket or the fact that, he's had these skills for a long time now. I noticed even in the Shield, early on this year in the Shield, the way he played spin bowling, and he's been a good player of spin bowling for a long time. But I guess the rest of the South Australian team really struggled against our spinners in that particular fixture, and Alex was just continuing to sort of take risks and move the scoreboard forward with the way that he played spin on a wicket that was very spin friendly. I remember in that game him making 2 very big innings that I guess changed the game and didn't allow us as a team to win. And I think his skill level against spin gets highlighted when we go to places, when Australia goes to places like Sri Lanka, where we went last time, and then obviously here at the Champions Trophy in this game against a really strong spin attack. In spin-friendly conditions, we see someone who has that class against spin bowling rise to the top there. And I think he took a lot of pressure off Steve in that partnership as well. Steve was able to just keep anchoring the innings while Alex was, finding boundaries at sort of regular intervals there. And it did look like at one stage they might have been able to get up to 300 or over 300, but unfortunately Steve got out, basically taking his first risk for a while, or like higher risk shot that he tried to execute for a little while. And sort of in that moment, that was sort of what started Australia's little mini collapse there, or I guess, turned 300 into 265.
You mentioned that Steve was circumspect for a lot of his innings. He did take a few risks. I noticed in particular that the first ball of Mohammed Shami's over, every time Shami came back into the attack, Steve ran at him, and eventually running at him was his downfall as he missed a full toss. A couple of things on Shami. I think, firstly, off the back of my point on Steve targeting him, I am interested about your view, or like if you could give us a little bit of insight on, in one-day cricket in particular, or T20 cricket, white ball cricket, are there particular bowlers from the other team that, as a team or personally, you're going, that's the guy I'm going after? I've kind of made a decision that I'm going to try and get 10, 12, 14 off that guy when he comes on? Or is it play the ball as it comes, depending on the match situation, whether you go after a certain bloke?
Yeah, look, there might be teams or players where I don't think it's a team decision. I think a lot more of the time it's how you match up or feel individually against a certain bowler. So it won't be a batting order that just decides, oh yeah, we're all going to take on Shami. Obviously not everyone's techniques and styles will be suitable to do that. So there might be 1 or 2 batters who feel comfortable doing it. But, you only have to look as far as Carey. For him, it's taking on spin and taking those risks against the spin. And not to say that he can't do it against the seam, but Steve obviously decided he was going to try and put a lot of pressure on, I guess, their top dog in that bowling attack in terms of pace, bowling, and I guess trying to get him under the pump early in his spell, so that he was, I guess, bowling a little bit more defensively to Steve. Where then I think Steve's able to rotate strike a little bit easier once the bowler's thinking defensively rather than, attacking. So I think that might have been part of Steve's plan without knowing or obviously speaking to him. But trying to put a bowler under pressure early in their over or early in their spell a lot of the time is to get them feeling like, oh no, this batter's after me, and get them in a slightly more defensive mindset. So I'm sure that's what Steve was trying to do. But as you say there are always bowlers that you have preferences both for and against. And when you're facing up against someone that you prefer facing, you definitely, you tend to up the ante a little bit. So, and that scale changes from, team to team and player to player of how much you're for and against a bowler, I guess. And, I think the level of how much you look to score off them is basically on par with, how you feel somewhere along that scale.
I remember when Chris Green was on the show a couple of months ago, you were good enough to remind him that you targeted him and hit him 30 rows back at one point in a Big Bash game. So you were...
He's high on my scale, Tom.
You were gentlemanly in the way you answered that question, but I know there are certain blokes that you certainly line up in the Big Bash. While we're on Mohammed Shami, I have sung his praises a bit this summer because I still believe that had he been here for the Test series, potentially he would have been the X factor or the complement to Bumrah that India needed and potentially could have got them over the line, particularly in some of the closer Test matches. In this game, he bowled 10 overs and took 3 for 48. I think the other impressive thing about his performance in this game was that, completely lost my train of thought there. He was brought back for quite a few short spells, which I think as a quick, fast bowler would be difficult. You don't really get any chance to get your rhythm, and I noticed that he was lent on to come back and stem the flow of runs a couple of times, which he did really well with 2-3 over spells. He's obviously not the youngest bowler, but I feel like as they go to England, he's going to be a big part of what their plans over the next couple of months.
Yeah, you tend to do that with your strike bowler in one-day cricket because you never want to let the opposition feel like, they get to go 30 or 35 overs without facing, your best bowler. So rather than using them in sort of 2 5-over spells, you tend to use them across 4 or 5 spells. So the game's never really going that long without the batters having to face, the best bowler. As I think I mentioned it on the last episode, say for when Bumrah's playing in your team, but when your best bowler's playing in your team, their overs are like hen's teeth, and you want to use them sparingly, as you've touched on there with how India used him in sort of shorter spells or smaller spells. It has, it's not as much about fitness and their ability to bowl long spells, but more about, getting that impact on the game frequently within a 50-over game, rather than batters just having to say to each other in a partnership, if we just get through this spell, he's done for the game, or he won't bowl again until the 45th or something like that. So there's only like the fact that they're able to use them in short spells, and it gives Shami say 4 opportunities to have an impact on the game in terms of bowling spells.
I completely butchered that last thing I was saying because I couldn't for the life of me get Rohit Sharma's name as I was speaking. But you kind of rescued me, which you always do, Moe. I'm very appreciative for that.
And I actually forgot to answer the second part of your question, Tom. And in terms of Shami going to England, huge. I think it's a huge in for them in England. The way he has the perfect seam position for England, I think, and he the way he controls an SG ball and a Kookaburra ball and the seam positions on that, on those 2 particular brand of balls is absolutely phenomenal. And I think the Duke ball is the easiest of the 3 balls to swing and move around. So, I'd say for Shami, he's going to pick up that Duke ball and feel like he's going to be bowling, with a tennis ball that has tape on one side, and he's going to be able to move that ball around, whichever way he pleases. So I think he's going to really enjoy those conditions. Of course, we know in England you do get either those types of conditions or, conditions that are very nice for batting when the wicket slows down and the ball gets older. But in terms of bowling with the new ball in England, I'm not sure there'll be many better than Mohammed Shami.
I am such a big Mohammed Shami fan. If you compare his kind of somewhat shorter stature, he's not the fittest looking fella. And if you compare him to Hazelwood, Cummins, Stark, and the fact that he's not bowling that much slower than them. In fact, he nudges 140 clicks an hour. It's pretty impressive, the fact that he's no nonsense, bustles in, and he kind of rushes the batsman, despite the fact that he may not look like one of these big buffs. But an amazing performance by him, and he's going to be critical as they go against New Zealand in the final in a couple of days. I think before we move into the other semi-final, the Indian batting, we've spoken a lot about Kohli. You mentioned that KL Rahul was able to anchor their innings at the end there. The other thing I'm interested in on KL Rahul is, we've got Australia with 2 specialist wicketkeepers in the team at the moment. India actually went in with no specialist wicketkeeper. I've had a bugbear for about 10 years as a second-grade captain in Sydney about the fact that I think in one-day cricket or shorter form cricket, you don't need a specialist wicketkeeper. But the fact that India went into a tournament where spin was predicted to play a heavy part, and in fact, they've got 4 specialist spinners in their team, and they've backed KL Rahul to take the gloves, was pretty surprising given they've got some handy keepers in their system. Are you surprised by how well he's done keeping and then being able to bat in the middle order as well?
I'm surprised that you think he's a part-time wicketkeeper, Tom. But I think that's unfair on KL's wicket-keeping ability, and he's a lot more than a part-time wicketkeeper. Sure, he's maybe not as good behind the stumps as a Dural, a full-time, I guess, guys that do it as much in the longer formats of the game as well. But I think his wicket keeping is plenty good enough. And would have been an option to take the gloves for India during the summer in the Test series as well, if they decided that Dural wasn't in their best, sort of their top 7 batters. So I think
obviously Rishabh Pant available for the summer.
Yeah.
I guess unexpectedly, they thought he might have been out of that Test series, but he ended up being able to play all 5 games. Yeah,
exactly. And I think Pant not in that team, Dural not in that team early in those first couple of games, then maybe KL does take the gloves there. And we've seen him take the gloves before in the longer format of the game, but plenty good enough behind the stumps, and was only sort of checking out his statistics in one-day international cricket. Again, phenomenal numbers, and still probably a little, quite young in his career, despite his skill level, but almost averaging 50 in one-day cricket internationally. And again, sort of in that same mold as Kohli, he scored his first 20 runs the other night. I think he sort of got to about 18 off 22 without hitting a boundary. And then you could see him he decided that he was going to start taking a bit of the pressure off Kohli, and he started to take a few more risks. And I've seen that firsthand when I've played IPL with him. Once KL starts thinking boundaries and moving the game forward, he's very, very hard to stop. And unfortunately, the Australian bowlers couldn't stop him.
Yeah, I mean, the Aussie bowlers, Nathan Ellis was 10 overs, 2 for 49. Adam Zampa, ever reliable, 10 overs, 2 for 60. Cooper Connolly, despite not having his best day with the bat, bowled 8 overs, 1 for 37. But I think the stat that stood out for me was the fact that, let me just find it, India's spinners ended the game with a collective dot ball percentage of exactly 50, and Australia's was just over 39. So the fact that the Aussie spinners weren't able to stem the flow of runs quite like the Indians were probably proved the difference through those middle overs. India able to just kind of keep chipping away when Australia got a bit bogged down.
I completely agree, Tom. And I'd love to hear your opinion on, I guess KL Rahul's wicket keeping there. How would he have looked? How would he looked at, in the East? Would he have been able to take the gloves in second grade for East when you were captaining there?
Would KL Rahul have been able to take the gloves?
Yeah.
Well, famously, I used to not pick a wicket-keeper in limited overs cricket, and despite being 6'2" and not the most agile bloke, I would in fact take the gloves. And there's some hilarious photos of me keeping without wicket-keeping pads in, not that second-grade cricket is the Champions Trophy, but in big games for East, I would keep without pads and without a hat often as well. So I do fancy myself as a little bit of an MS Dhoni as well, Moe. Just getting off
So
my.
KL Rahul, sorry, mate, you're playing threes, or is he just in the team as a batter?
No, he could have done whatever he wanted in my teams, Mo. The last thing I wanted to touch on that game is that I thought Steve Smith was pretty classy in the post game interview about the fact that he was pressed on the fact that India have been able to play all their games in Dubai while all the other teams have moved around. I heard something the other day like if South Africa had been able to make the final, which they ultimately didn't, they would have boarded 8 flights through the course of the tournament, including the flight leaving South Africa. And India have effectively just been able to set up camp in Dubai with no travel at all. There was the story last week about the fact that all the teams travelled to Dubai because no one knew who was going to be playing where. South Africa and New Zealand flew back to Pakistan to play their semi-final. But, Steve, when asked about this, pretty much just said, look, I don't see it as much of an advantage. We could have won today if we'd played a bit better. Full credit to India, and he said that they deserve to be in the final. Are you reading much into the fact that India haven't had to travel around and have been able to set up their base at one ground?
Oh, look, there's no doubt that's an advantage just to the comfort levels of a touring group. How much that, plays advantage in, I guess, the actual time on field when you're performing, I'm not sure, but it would definitely, it's a huge advantage off the field. And, in terms of the mental space of the touring teams, I'd much rather just turn up somewhere and set up camp and stay there for 3 weeks rather than having to travel to and from and, do that sort of domestic travel. It gives them a lot more training time or a lot more downtime as well. So
what about hydration as well? Like I know if I go on a golf trip, I'm pretty worried about my hydration levels for my first couple of rounds if I've been on a flight because, I do find a flight really wreaks havoc with my hydration levels. Tend to get a bit of a headache, maybe constipation off the back of the flight. So surely the teams get a little bit worried about that, having to board flights all the time.
Yeah, really worried about hydration levels. And it's a big advantage, India were able to stay extra hydrated for the Champions Trophy because they didn't have to board those domestic flights, mate. But yeah, no, it is an advantage, but I think as Steve's touched on there, if Australia were good enough in that game, they still could have won. I'm not sure how much that advantage plays out on the actual cricket field because I do think, both teams just give everything they do have for that time. But I think the advantage is, I'm sure it plays, it might play 1%, but I'm sure the advantages are definitely enjoyed off the field rather than on the field in terms of, being able to stay in one place.
I saw that India have lost. If they did have any advantage, I guess this is a reason that they've potentially given that away. I think Rohit Sharma has lost his last 16 tosses in one-day cricket, and there's some amazing stats around the probability of losing 16 tosses in a row, and it's literally astronomical. It's up there with winning the lottery. So Australia won that toss. They chose to bat first, and certainly as someone who was watching, hoping that Australia would win, the whole way through their innings, I felt like, if a Glenn Maxwell had gone off at the end and if they'd got a total of 300, 310, 320, they did have every chance to win, and unfortunately they weren't able to. They did drop 3 critical catches in the first 15 overs as well. So full credit to India for winning that one. They were workmanlike in the way that they were able to win that, and they're into another big tournament final. They will be joined by New Zealand after last night. New Zealand won by 50 runs. They got the highest Champions Trophy total of all time, 6 of 362. And they had a massive partnership by my man Rachin Ravindra and Kane Williamson. They put on 164 runs for the second or third wicket. A pretty impressive display. And one that's set up New Zealand for another big final in a one-day tournament. This is the 5th semi-final that New Zealand have won at an ICC ODI event, while South Africa have lost 9 out of 11, which is pretty amazing. South Africa have lost 9 of 11. They've only won 1. And their search for a second major title after they won the Champions Trophy in 1998 goes on. Pretty amazing, and we said it in one of an earlier episode. New Zealand are able to just get over the line in these big semi-finals. They may not always win the final, but for a small country, cricket isn't even their number one sport. They do a pretty amazing job of punching above their weight.
They certainly do, Tom. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about, what South Africa need to do to start turning some of their form around, mate.
I think it's a genuine choke. I can't. The more it goes on, Curse of 1999, of course, always gets mentioned. They've had some absolute mares with Duckworth Lewis over the years as well, but they were heavily favoured to win last night, and New Zealand have pummeled them. They've completely pummeled them. Dave Miller's 100 was literally completely in vain. The second 50 that he scored, the game was already over. New Zealand were so tradesman-like in the way that they disposed of South Africa last night, and South Africa just weren't their best. They probably had the best bowling attack of the whole tournament, and New Zealand got the highest total in Champions Trophy history against them. So in terms of what I think South Africa spoke a bit about what it takes for a grade cricketer to be able to get their head around batting second when we were talking about whether to set totals or bat second last week. I think South Africa mentally at the moment aren't quite there to get across the line in these big games.
That's a very good summary, Tom. And I think maybe, as you said, yes, they just weren't at their best. But maybe if they hadn't had those 8 flights, they would have been a little bit more hydrated and able to perform.
AB de Villiers is a big follower of this podcast, and I know he remains a massive fan of South African cricket. I'd love to know if he's got any insight on whether they were hydrated for this game, because personally I think that there's no way they could have handled it.
Yeah, but back to New Zealand yesterday, I think what an amazing achievement for them again. I guess missing some of their more experienced and key bowlers in this tournament that we're used to seeing from them in Southey, Bolton, and Lockie Ferguson, and I think again well led by Mitch Santner, who's I think just a world-class cricketer, especially in these shorter formats. But to see Kane and Rachin come in and score the bulk of their runs and do the bulk of the batting for the team, that's what you call your key players standing up in these games, and they can't always stand up. A lot of the time key players will find a way to, but I guess across a longer tournament there will be games where these guys miss out, and that's when I guess the depth of a nation will get tested. But I guess with one more game to go, can a Kane or a Latham or a Rachin pull out another trick and get them over the line in terms of getting enough runs to beat India? They're the only team that have been able to do that so far at this tournament. So I'd definitely give them a chance. They've got some really high-skilled new ball bowling in Matt Henry, who was able to do some damage early last time against India. But in that game, I think we saw the benefits of, I guess, winning the toss, as you mentioned there, and the odds of Rohit continuously losing. I think in these conditions, the fact that India have continued to lose tosses but win games is a testament to them, because I do think the toss in these conditions is quite important, and especially in one-day cricket. So I feel like this, that again in the final, the toss will be important, but I'd say, I would say if the toss is lost, India would be the only team that can win it.
I am not the most liquid that I've ever been in my life before, but I think I might have 10 grand on India to win the toss in this next one. They cannot possibly lose another toss. That sounds like the words of a degenerate gambler, which I'm not, but I feel like they've got to be due to win a toss in this next game.
I reckon 50-50 for this game to win the toss.
Speaking of the man who is named after Rahul Dravid and Sachin Tendulkar, he now has 5 ODI hundreds, and they've all come in big tournaments. They're all World Cup or Champions Trophy hundreds. I'm interested to get your view or your experience of these guys who are certified big game players. I guess as a teammate and also as an opponent, how do you, is there something that you see in the eyes of these guys where you're in a big game, the crunch time is on, and you can see that they're up for it and they're ready to go to that next level? Because it's certainly not the case for everyone. Just ask South African cricket if they've got guys who can do it. But Rachin Ravindra certainly has no issue. Cometh the moment, cometh the man, which I've already said. But in the big moments, this guy steps up.
He certainly does. And look, I don't know if it's stepping up or just not stepping down, in the sense that I guess there's no difference in a semi-final or a grand final in terms of what happens inside the field. The only differences are the external noise and I guess the consequences of what happens from on the field. So
But you can
this
say
is
there's no difference, but we all know it doesn't matter whether you're a Test cricketer or an amateur in any sport. I mean, a 2-foot putt, suddenly looks like a 20-foot putt when there's a match play event on the line. And I think for these things, facing up to whatever bowler, it's not the same as if you're facing up in a normal, a bilateral one-day series. There's something about guys like Rachin Ravindra that is just, it clicks, and they don't seem to feel the pressure of these moments like other people might.
Well, I think that's the point there in what you've just said is they just don't change as much as other people do. So they won't feel as much stress, or they won't feel as much pressure as someone else might, who is thinking about the consequences of what happens if they miss out, or is thinking about, I hope we do this because then we'll win and we'll get this. And I think it's those guys who are able to stay in the moment longer, stay present longer, and stay focused on their task rather than the outcome of their task in these types of games. That because the task hasn't changed, which is my point. It's the consequence of the task that has changed, and I guess what's riding on that. So I think it's the guys who I guess are able to stay focused on what needs to be done in that moment, rather than focused on the possibilities of what might happen if the task is done or not.
Is there a particular time when the chips have been down that you've stepped up and won a game where you were nervous, there was more on the line than there usually is, and you were able to get your team on the line? Is there one game that stands out for you?
Not really.
The
No,
chuckle of a man who's done it many times.
no. Well, it's just I feel like talking about my feats here would
Do you want me to tell you about a time that I've done it?
No, I'm actually trying to talk about the scale of international cricket and domestic cricket. Whilst I've been able to do it in domestic finals, it's just not the same as international cricket finals and a World Cup final or a Champions Trophy final or a World Test final. So, I think, whilst there is an increase in pressure, etc., whether it's a BBL final and a normal BBL game, you've got to multiply that by 10 to then, I guess, understand or experience what these guys are feeling, ahead of the Champions Trophy final, or what they might be feeling ahead of a World Cup final, or something like that. The closest thing I could probably come to is the IPL final, or maybe a Big Bash final, or even just, I guess, playing in the Champions Trophy or a ODI series, and you're coming up into the third game of that series and it's 1-1, or any test match that you play. But it is a different level of, I guess, expectation and consequence. And I'd love to hear your input on some finals games of grade cricket that you've played, and how you've strutted about the workplace on a Monday after, scoring a quick fire 34.
The closest I've ever done was we needed 120 off 10 overs, and in the second last over of this game, I hit 3 sixes in a row at Glen McGrath Oval in Sutherland. Then we needed one off the last ball, and I was on strike, and I thought I was going to be the absolute hero. I hit one to mid-wicket where young Austin Waugh, Steve Waugh's son, was fielding. He was about 14 or 15, but the best fielder in the comp at the time. I just took off and said yes, and he ran me out by half the wicket, so we didn't actually win. But, gee, I came close to an amazing match-winning performance that day. But, yeah, as I said, I don't have it. These blokes do. And Big Rachin, I'm in awe of what he's able to do, because he seems to really bat better than normal in these massive games. The other person I wanted to talk about quickly was Mitch Santner. As you have been so many times this summer, right on the ball, Mo. You called out Santner early in the tournament as a guy who would be key. He's obviously stepped into the captaincy of this team, and last night he bowled 10 overs and took 3 for 43, seemed to take the critical wickets whenever it was required. He is, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the power of leg spin in white ball cricket. Adam Zampa, Kuldeep Yadav have had big tournaments, but Mitch Santner is still right up there with them as a white ball tweaker.
Oh, absolutely. His 10 overs basically is the game, in my opinion. The other 40 overs, South Africa have basically gone at pretty close to 7 runs and over. So almost at the target of what they needed to get. And then for his 10 overs, they were only able to achieve 4 and over and lose 3 wickets in doing so. So, that 10 overs basically changes the game, in my opinion. South Africa still scored 315 runs. That ended up losing by 40 or 50 runs or something like that. But, I think that 10 overs is the game. If that 10 overs goes none for 75 instead of 3 for 40, it's a completely different game. And I just think that was just the match changing or the game changing or game ending sort of spell. If you want to call it,
he quite literally did he just put an end to the game, didn't he? Because despite the fact Dave Miller got 100 off 67 balls, most of the damage in that innings actually came once South Africa were well and truly out of the game off the back of Santner's bowling.
That's right, yeah.
The last thing I was going to call out quickly, I mean, just because you spoke about the fact that Santner's spell or overs kind of sealed it for New Zealand, I thought the other interesting thing to point out was Daryl Mitchell and Glenn Phillips had a kind of power partnership at the end of the New Zealand innings, and it does show it's handy, and it is something that these teams do these days to keep power hitters down the order, and I guess those kind of partnerships can really accelerate a total of what would have been 260, 270, up towards 350, and in this case 350 plus. You kind of feel like if Glenn Maxwell and a Benny Dwarshuis had been able to get onto a couple the other night in the last 10 overs for Australia, they might have made a total that was kind of well and truly up over 320, 330. But in this case, New Zealand were able to provide that little spark at the end of their innings, and I guess it made it a total that was almost unassailable.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that they obviously got a really good base given to them by Rachin and Kane, but that still could have been South Africa still could have kept that to about 300 or 310 if it wasn't for that partnership at the end, which got them to 360, which again proved to be another difference as to why New Zealand were able to get over the line. But yeah, I think you touched and made a very good point there, Tom, about that and about, the difference in, I guess, finishing off an innings and what happens when you do it well. And unfortunately for Australia, what happens when you don't.
Glenn Maxwell's 6 that was then followed by him getting bowled middle stump was, I think the commentator said at the time that those 2 balls really summarised Glenn Maxwell as an international cricketer or something like that. But that was the moment when I went to bed because I felt like without an innings like the ones that we have seen from Glenn Maxwell, Australia weren't going to quite get enough. And, I know the game pretty well, so I ended up being right about that one. Matt Henry was the only fast bowler in this game to go for under 7 and over and is now under an injury cloud, which kind of takes us to the final. Let's look at the final a little bit, Moe. I guess straight off the bat, India, New Zealand. India with a pretty good record in these finals despite having lost the 2023 World Cup to Australia off the back of an amazing bowling performance by Pat Cummins and obviously Travis Head's big innings. Do you think they get over the line with this one?
Tom, I'm in a bit of a rush to get going. I'm going to say India win, and there's no other result possible.
I'm backing New Zealand. I'm so on Rachin Ravindra and Mitch Santner at the moment that I think it's 2 finals in a row that India go down. I'm pretty excited about where cricket's at because I think India have done an amazing job to play so well in this tournament off the back of their losses to New Zealand and Australia in Test cricket. But they now go to England, where I think they will be favoured to beat England, given the fact that England are under a bit of duress at the moment. But if England can put up a big fight, we then get to see England in Australia. So this final, I think, does quite a bit to set up what's a pretty exciting year left in cricket. Moe, quickly, who do you think man of the match will be in the final?
Man of the match in the final, I'm going to go with Jadeja.
Yeah, I like that as well. For me, I think I've crapped on a bit about Rachin this game. I think Matt Henry gets out of the injury cloud and goes against the grain as a fast bowler and turns one on and gets New Zealand over the line. Yeah, big game. Sunday night, 8 p.m. in Dubai, India. Will not have to deal with any of the impacts of dehydration, as they will not be boarding a flight. They will turn out, I'm guessing, the same 11 that was able to beat Australia. They will be heavily favoured. Moe's on the back of them, but go on the Kiwis. Our brothers from across the ditch, I think they're going to get over the line. They're well due to win one of these tournaments. Moe, you do have to go because you're getting on the bus for New South Wales' big game against WA that starts today in Perth. How are the boys looking? Massive game because WA just lurking behind you guys on the Shield table.
Yeah, huge game. But boys are looking good. We've been here for 2 days, done some good training on some pretty spicy Perth whacker training wickets. So I'm no doubt the wicket out in the middle is going to have a little bit of spice to it as well. Sam Constance looks in fantastic form, so I'm expecting big things from him. Nick Maddinson to kick off his big season, hopefully with his next 2 games, and hopefully this will be one of his innings back to form and get his name up in the selectors' eyes again.
You beat me to it, but yeah, I think as we like to do, we make big predictions on this show, and we're going to revisit this when we are right next week, because I think Matto will get 100 in this game. Mark down the timestamp, Hugo, because we've both called it. I think the other big story in Shield cricket, Moe, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, but Kuhnemann is back for Tasmania's game against Queensland. I guess for him, he'll have a point to prove after having to go through having his action cleared and also up against his old Shield team this week as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. It's probably a nice game for him to play, given it is against Queensland, and he'll have a lot of his mates that he's playing against. So I doubt they'll get too personal with any sledging in that game. So he gets a nice reintroduction into first-class cricket after a tough couple of months for him.
Mate, I do want you to have enough time to have a shower before you get on the bus with the boys. I wouldn't want you getting on there with any morning breath and putting them off their last couple of hours of preparation. But very good of you to join us from the Wild West. I am glad that we're not doing this at 9:30 tonight, but hopefully you can catch up on the sleep that you lost this morning then.
Thanks, mate.
Very good. Once again, thanks for tuning in. If you want more Chin music, you know exactly where to find us. We will be back bigger and better next week with a review of the Champions Trophy final. Thanks as always. Cheers.
Well, there it was, ladies and gentlemen. Yet another episode of Chin Music. If you enjoyed it as much as we did, please hit the like and subscribe button somewhere under here, and we'll see you on the next one.
Oh, yes, Moe.